Hello everyone, thanks for tuning in. I know you use this video to fall asleep. If you enjoy our stories, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what city are you watching? I love seeing where you're listening from. Now, let's dive in. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, printed on government letterhead so official it made my coffee taste bitter. After 3 years of civilian life, 3 years of sleeping through the night without checking corners for shadows, they wanted me back. Dr. Sarah Chen, I read aloud to my empty apartment, the words foreign on my tongue. I'd been Sarah, the part-time college instructor, for so long, I'd almost forgotten the weight of my former title. Your specialized background in anomalous phenomena investigation makes you uniquely qualified for Department 47's latest initiative. Department 47. Even the name was designed to be forgettable, buried somewhere between motor vehicle registration and agricultural oversight in the federal directory. But I knew what it really was. The government's admission that some things couldn't be explained away with weather balloons and mass hysteria. The salary figure made me set down my mug. 6 figures, just to spend a few months exploring abandoned buildings and writing reports. After years of stretching adjunct professor wages, it seemed like a gift from whatever gods still listened to burned-out ex-military psychologists. I should have remembered that the government's gifts always came with strings attached. The Department 47 office occupied 3 floors of a brutally efficient concrete building in downtown D.C. No directory listed it. No signs marked its presence. Just a number stenciled in black paint above a reinforced steel door. Agent Marcus Webb met me in the lobby, if you could call the sterile waiting area with its single plastic chair and fluorescent humming a lobby. Webb looked like Central Casting's idea of a government spook. Gray suit, gray hair, eyes the color of winter clouds. The kind of man you'd forget 5 minutes after meeting him, which was probably the point. Dr. Chen, thank you for coming. His handshake was firm but brief, professional in that way that discouraged small talk. I trust your journey was comfortable. I nodded, following him through a maze of corridors lined with unmarked doors. The building felt hollow, as if most of its rooms stood empty. Our footsteps echoed despite the industrial carpeting. Your file indicates you specialized in anomalous psychological phenomena during your military service. Webb continued, stopping at an elevator that required both a keycard and a palm scanner. Mass hallucinations, collective delusions, that sort of thing. That's right. I watched the numbers descend past floors that shouldn't have existed. Basement levels B1 through B7 glowed on the display, though I found that most anomalous events had perfectly rational explanations once you dug deep enough. Webb's smile was thin as paper. Yes, we hoped you'd maintain that perspective. The elevator opened onto B5, revealing a conference room dominated by a massive table and wall-mounted monitors. 2 other people waited inside. A young man with nervous energy and expensive equipment cases, and a woman whose bearing screamed military, even in civilian clothes. Dr. Chen, meet your team, Webb said. David Park, our technical specialist, and Colonel Jennifer Hayes, security and logistics. David looked like he'd stepped out of a tech startup. Designer jeans, vintage band t-shirt, hair that cost more to style than I made in a week teaching Psychology 101. He stood to shake my hand, his grip surprisingly strong for someone who probably spent most of his time behind computer screens. Dr. Chen, I've read your work on crowd psychology during the Meridian incident. His words came fast, excited. Your analysis of how collective trauma can manifest as shared delusions. Brilliant stuff. Colonel Hayes remained seated, studying me with the calculated gaze of someone accustomed to evaluating threats. When she finally stood, her handshake was crushing, a not-so-subtle reminder that she could probably kill me in 6 different ways with the pen clipped to her pocket. "Doctor," she said simply. Webb activated the wall monitors, filling them with satellite imagery of what looked like an industrial complex surrounded by dense forest. The buildings were arranged in a rough rectangle around a central courtyard, connected by covered walkways. Even from space, the place radiated abandonment. Broken windows, collapsed sections of roof, parking lots choked with weeds. "This is Meridian Research Station," Webb began. Officially, it never existed. Unofficially, it was a joint military-civilian facility investigating advanced materials science from 1962 to 1987. The project was discontinued due to budget constraints. I studied the images, noting the facility's isolation. What kind of materials science required this level of secrecy? "The classified kind," Hayes interjected. "What matters is that the site's been abandoned for nearly 4 decades. No security, no maintenance, no human presence of any kind." Webb clicked to the next slide, showing a series of incident reports. 3 months ago, we started receiving reports from locals. Hikers going missing near the facility. Strange lights at night, unusual wildlife behavior, the sort of things that usually turn out to be drug runners or illegal dumping. "Usually," David added, his excitement dimming slightly. "So, we sent in a standard reconnaissance team," Webb continued. 2 agents, basic surveillance equipment, orders to document any illegal activity and report back within 72 hours. The monitors went black. "They never reported back," Hayes said. 48 hours later, we sent in a recovery team. Found their equipment scattered around the facility's perimeter. No sign of the agents themselves. I leaned forward, studying Webb's expression. "Bodies? No bodies, no blood, no evidence of violence, just their gear, abandoned as if they'd simply walked away from it." Something cold settled in my stomach. I'd seen enough classified operations to recognize the careful language of official denial. "What aren't you telling me?" Webb exchanged glances with Hayes, some silent communication passing between them. "The recovery team did find something else." "David?" The young man fumbled with his tablet, bringing up an audio file. "This was recorded on Agent Martinez's equipment. Last transmission before they went silent." The speakers crackled with static, then resolved into a man's voice, professional but strained. "Base, this is Team Alpha. We've reached the facility perimeter. No signs of recent activity, but Jesus, this place feels wrong, like it's watching us. Thompson thinks we should—" The voice cut off mid-sentence, replaced by a sound that made my skin crawl. Not quite music, not quite noise, a rhythmic humming that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my bones. It lasted maybe 10 seconds before the recording ended in digital silence. "That's all we have," David said quietly. I sat back in my chair, processing. "And you want me to go in there and figure out what happened?" "We want you to go in there and prove it's nothing," Webb corrected. "Unusual acoustics, maybe some kind of natural phenomenon affecting the local wildlife. Give us a rational explanation we can put in a report and file away forever." The subtext was clear. Give them a story they could sell to whoever was asking questions about missing agents and taxpayer money. "What's my cover story if things go sideways?" Hayes answered without hesitation. "Environmental survey for the EPA. Dr. Park is your research assistant. I'm private security hired by the contractor. Clean and simple." I studied the three faces around the table, noting the careful neutrality in their expressions. These people were professionals, good at their jobs, and they were scared of something. That should have been my first clue to walk away. Instead, I heard myself saying, "When do we leave?" We drove north from D.C. in a nondescript SUV loaded with enough electronic equipment to outfit a small TV station. David had insisted on bringing everything from thermal imaging cameras to electromagnetic field detectors, muttering about baseline readings and environmental factors, while Hayes checked and rechecked her sidearm. The facility was 3 hours into the Virginia wilderness, accessible only by increasingly narrow roads that eventually gave way to a gravel track barely wide enough for our vehicle. Ancient pine trees pressed close on both sides, their branches forming a canopy so thick that noon felt like twilight. "GPS is cutting in and out," David announced from the passenger seat, his tablet flickering between satellite view and blue void. Must be the tree cover, or something else, I thought, but didn't say. In my experience, technology failed around truly anomalous sites with depressing regularity. Hayes guided the SUV around a final bend, and Meridian Research Station spread out before us like a concrete cancer in the forest's green flesh. The satellite images hadn't captured the facility's oppressive atmosphere. The way the buildings seemed to lean inward, creating shadows that moved wrong in the afternoon light. Chain-link fence surrounded the complex, topped with razor wire that had long since rusted to brown scales. "Home sweet home," Hayes muttered, parking beside a gap in the perimeter where some long-ago storm had brought down a section of fence. We unloaded equipment in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. The forest around us was unnaturally quiet. No bird songs, no insect buzz, not even the whisper of wind through leaves. Just the sound of our breathing and the distant creak of metal settling in the heat. The main building loomed 7 stories above the courtyard, its brutalist architecture designed more for function than form. Most of the windows on the upper floors were broken, dark squares that reminded me uncomfortably of empty eye sockets. Smaller structures clustered around the central tower like architectural fungi. Laboratories, storage buildings, what might have been a cafeteria. According to the blueprints, the main research areas were on floors 3 through 6, David said, consulting his tablet. Administrative offices on 1 and 2, mechanical systems in the basement levels. I shouldered my pack, heavy with recording equipment and sample containers. Any idea what they were researching? Hayes was already walking toward the main entrance, her hand resting casually on her holstered pistol. Material science, that's all we need to know. The front doors had been chained shut decades ago, but time and weather had corroded the links into rust-brown dust. Hayes kicked them aside and pushed through into the lobby, her flashlight beam cutting through air thick with motes of disturbed dust. Inside, Meridian looked like every other abandoned government facility I'd seen. Institutional furniture left to rot, water damage staining the walls in organic patterns, nature slowly reclaiming human spaces. But there was something else, something that made the hair on my arms stand up in the stale air. It felt inhabited, not by anything living exactly, more like the building itself had developed a consciousness during its decades of abandonment, a slow and alien awareness that pressed against the edges of perception. Every shadow seemed to hold potential movement. Every creak and settle of old metal suggested purposeful activity just beyond the range of hearing. "Jesus, this place gives me the creeps," David whispered, his words echoing in the empty lobby. Hayes shushed him with a sharp gesture, her head tilted as if listening for something. After a long moment, she relaxed slightly. "Sound carries in here. We need to be careful about noise discipline." We spent the rest of the day establishing our base camp in what had been the facility's main conference room. David deployed his sensors while I documented everything with methodical photographs and detailed notes. Hayes maintained watch, moving between windows with practiced efficiency. As afternoon faded to evening, we prepared for our first night in the facility. David had rigged motion detectors at every entrance to the conference room, their infrared beams creating an invisible perimeter. Hayes insisted on watch rotations. 4 hours on, 4 hours off. "You really think that's necessary?" I asked, unrolling my sleeping bag on the conference table. She looked at me over the barrel of her rifle, which she was cleaning with mechanical precision. "2 agents disappeared here, Doctor. I'm not taking any chances. I was too tired to argue." The drive and day of setup had left me drained, and my body felt heavy with the particular exhaustion that came from sustained stress. I'd experienced it during my military service, the way hypervigilance burned through energy reserves, leaving you simultaneously wired and exhausted. David took first watch, settling into a chair facing the room's main entrance with his tablet glowing softly in his lap. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but the building's presence pressed against my consciousness like a weight. Every small sound seemed magnified: the ping of cooling metal, the whisper of air through broken windows, the almost inaudible hum that might have been old electrical systems or something else entirely. I was finally drifting off when David's sharp intake of breath brought me instantly alert. "What is it?" I whispered, sitting up on the table. He was staring at his tablet, face pale in the screen's glow. "Motion detector just triggered. Something came through the main entrance." Hayes was already moving, rifle in her hands, approaching the conference room door with liquid silence. She pressed her ear against the wood, listening. Nothing. Long seconds passed. Then, from somewhere in the building's depths, came the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving through the corridors with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where they were going. Hayes backed away from the door, her weapon raised. The footsteps grew closer, echoing in the empty hallways like a countdown. Then they stopped. We waited, barely breathing, for what felt like hours. But the footsteps didn't resume, and David's motion detectors remained silent. Whatever had entered the building was no longer moving, or no longer there. "Could be an animal," I suggested quietly. "Deer, maybe, or—" "Deer don't climb stairs," David interrupted, his voice tight. "According to the sensors, whatever it was went up to the second floor." Hayes kept her rifle trained on the door. "We maintain watch rotation. Nobody goes anywhere alone. And if those sensors trigger again, we find out what's moving around in here." I lay back down, but sleep was impossible. Every shadow seemed to shift. Every sound carried sinister potential. And somewhere in the building above us, something waited in the darkness. Morning brought no relief from the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to permeate every corner of Meridian Station. If anything, daylight made things worse. The long corridors stretched into shadows that electric lights couldn't quite dispel, and the broken windows cast geometric patterns on the walls that hurt to look at directly. We'd decided to start our investigation on the 3rd floor, where David's readings showed the highest levels of electromagnetic anomalies. The elevator shaft gaped like a throat, its cables long since corroded, so we took the stairs. Our footsteps echoed in the narrow stairwell, creating a rhythm that seemed to persist even when we stopped moving. EMF readings are off the charts up here, David reported, consulting his handheld detector. The device emitted a steady stream of electronic chirps that increased in frequency as we climbed. Whatever they were doing in this facility, it left a hell of an electromagnetic signature. The third-floor corridor stretched away in both directions, lined with doors marked only with numbers and faded security warnings. Emergency lighting strips along the baseboards flickered intermittently, creating a strobing effect that made depth perception difficult. Hayes took point, her rifle at the ready as we moved toward the first laboratory. The door stood slightly ajar, and she nudged it open with her boot before stepping inside. The lab looked like it had been abandoned mid-experiment. Workbenches were covered with equipment I didn't recognize, metallic frameworks that twisted in geometrically impossible ways, devices that seemed to bend light around themselves, instruments whose purposes I couldn't even guess at. Whiteboards covered the walls, filled with equations that made my eyes water when I tried to focus on them. What the hell were they working on? David breathed, running his scanner over one of the twisted metal constructs. I photographed everything methodically, but the camera seemed to have trouble focusing. The images on the LCD screen looked blurred, distorted, as if reality itself was slightly out of phase in this room. Hayes was examining a bank of monitors along the far wall, their screens dark but somehow still menacing. Power's been out for decades, but these look like they were built to last. Military grade. The whole place has military-grade everything, I observed, noting the reinforced construction, the blast-resistant windows, the multiple layers of security doors. This wasn't just a research facility. It was designed to contain something. We moved through the laboratory systematically, documenting everything. But the more I saw, the less sense any of it made. The equipment seemed designed according to principles that violated basic physics. The equations on the whiteboards referenced mathematical concepts I'd never encountered, using symbols that weren't part of any notation system I knew. It was in the fourth lab that we found the first body. The skeleton was slumped over a workbench, still wearing the tattered remains of a lab coat. Empty eye sockets stared at an array of instruments that looked like a cross between a radio telescope and a surgical table. A plastic ID badge hung from the coat pocket. Dr. Martin Reeves, Senior Research Physicist. Been here a while? Hayes observed clinically, though I caught the slight tremor in her voice. 37 years, give or take, I said, kneeling beside the remains. But look at this. The bones showed no signs of trauma. No bullet holes, no fractures, no evidence of violence or disease. Dr. Reeves appeared to have simply sat down at his workbench and died, like he'd been switched off. David's electromagnetic detector was going crazy, the chirping so fast it created an almost continuous tone. Whatever this equipment was designed to do, it's still doing it. These readings are impossible. The EM field is actually getting stronger. I stood up, brushing dust from my knees. Stronger than what? Stronger than when I first measured it. The field intensity has increased by 15% in the last 10 minutes. Hayes and I exchanged glances. Electronic equipment that had been abandoned for decades didn't spontaneously increase its output. It degraded, failed, went silent. It didn't wake up. We should move to the next floor, Hayes said, but her words were cut off by a sound from somewhere in the building below us. A low, rhythmic humming that seemed to emerge from the walls themselves. It was the same sound from the audio recording, the sound that had preceded the disappearance of Agent Martinez and his partner. David's tablet screen flickered, displaying readouts that shifted too fast to follow. The entire electromagnetic spectrum is going haywire. It's like the building is generating some kind of interference pattern. The humming grew louder, more complex, developing harmonies that created an almost musical structure. But it wasn't any kind of music that human ears were meant to hear. The frequencies seemed to bypass auditory processing entirely, resonating in my bones, my teeth, the fluid in my inner ear. "We need to get out of here," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I realized it might already be too late. The laboratory around us was changing. The twisted metal constructs were unfolding, extending appendages that shouldn't have been able to exist in three-dimensional space. The equations on the whiteboards were rewriting themselves, symbols flowing like liquid mercury across the white surfaces. The dead monitors were flickering to life, displaying images that hurt to perceive directly. Hayes raised her rifle, but what could she shoot? The threat wasn't something that bullets could stop. It was reality itself coming unstuck, the laws of physics bending under the weight of 37 years of accumulated wrongness. "The stairwell," David gasped, his tablet sparking in his hands. "We have to get to the stairwell." We ran, leaving our careful documentation behind, fleeing through corridors that seemed to stretch and contract like living tissue. The humming followed us, joined by other sounds, whispers in languages that had never been spoken by human mouths, the scrape of metal on stone, the wet sound of things growing in the darkness. Behind us, Meridian Station was waking up, and we were trapped inside its dreams. The stairwell offered no sanctuary. As we descended toward the second floor, the concrete walls began to exhibit properties that concrete walls shouldn't possess. They rippled like water, developed geometric patterns that seemed to exist in more than 3 dimensions, reflected light that came from no visible source. "The whole building is some kind of machine," David panted, clutching his smoking tablet. "The research, the equipment, even the architecture. It's all part of a single massive device." Hayes kept her weapon ready, though we all understood by now that conventional firearms would be useless against what we were facing. A device designed to do what? I thought about the equations I'd seen, the impossible geometries of the research equipment, the way Dr. Reeves had died without any apparent cause. Not designed to do anything, designed to study something. They were researchers, not engineers. They found something and brought it here to examine it. "Found what?" David asked. Before I could answer, the humming stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the noise had been, a vacuum of sound that seemed to suck the air from our lungs. Then, from somewhere above us, came a new sound. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, descending the stairs we had just used. But we were the only living things in the building. Weren't we? Hayes motioned for silence, pressing herself against the stairwell wall. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by a soft susurrus that might have been breathing or might have been wind through broken windows. Whatever was approaching moved with patient confidence, like it had all the time in the world. The footsteps reached the landing above us and stopped. In the ringing silence that followed, I could hear my own heartbeat, David's rapid breathing, the almost inaudible whir of Hayes's rifle scope as she trained it upward. Then a voice called down to us. A man's voice, professional and calm, with just a hint of strain around the edges. "Base, this is Team Alpha. We've reached the facility perimeter. No signs of recent activity, but Jesus, this place feels wrong. It was Agent Martinez, the same voice from the recording, speaking the same words in the same tone. But Martinez had disappeared 3 months ago. Hayes's finger tightened on her trigger, but she held fire. Smart woman. What do you shoot when reality itself is compromised? The voice continued, playing out the scene from the audio log. Thompson thinks we should... And then that horrible non-music began again. The rhythmic humming that bypassed the ears and resonated directly in the nervous system. But now I understood what it was. It wasn't a sound at all. It was a signal, a carrier wave broadcasting something that human brains interpreted as audio because they had no other frame of reference. They're not gone, I whispered, realization hitting me like cold water. Martinez and Thompson, the original research team, Dr. Reeves, they're all still here. The building is replaying them, recording and playback over and over. David's face had gone pale. A recording device the size of an entire facility? Not recording, translating, converting human consciousness into something else, something that can exist within whatever framework they discovered here. The footsteps resumed, closer now. Through the gap between staircases, I could see a figure descending toward us. A man in military fatigues, moving with the careful precision of a trained operative. He looked exactly like the photos of Agent Martinez I'd seen in his personnel file, except for his eyes. His eyes were empty. Not dead, not unconscious. Simply absent, as if the person who had once looked out through them had been carefully removed, leaving only the biological machinery behind. Hayes fired. 3 quick bursts, center mass, textbook marksmanship. The bullets passed through Martinez without effect, as if he were made of smoke and shadow. He continued his measured descent, reaching out with one hand in a gesture that seemed almost welcoming. "Run," I said. We ran. Down the stairs, through the lobby, past our abandoned equipment, and out into the afternoon sunlight. The forest around Meridian Station looked different now. The trees seemed to lean inward, their branches creating patterns that echoed the equations I'd seen on the laboratory whiteboards. The sky above was the wrong shade of blue, and shadows fell at angles that defied the position of the sun. "The vehicle," Hayes gasped, pointing toward our SUV. "We can still..." The SUV wasn't there anymore. In its place stood a different vehicle, a military transport vehicle that looked like it had been manufactured in the 1980s. Through its windows, I could see 2 figures in the front seats, sitting perfectly still, staring straight ahead with empty eyes. Thompson and Martinez. The original Team Alpha, still carrying out their mission, still radiating back to base that they'd reached the facility perimeter and found no signs of recent activity. "The whole area is affected," David said, his voice hollow with understanding. "Whatever they discovered here, it's been spreading outward for 37 years. Slowly, but continuously, converting everything it touches into part of its structure." I thought about the hikers who had gone missing, the strange wildlife behavior, the reports of lights in the forest. How far do you think it extends? Before anyone could answer, we heard the sound of the building's main doors opening behind us. More figures emerged from Meridian Station, men and women in lab coats and military uniforms, moving with the same patient precision as Martinez. Dr. Reeves was among them, looking exactly as he had in life, if you ignored the total absence of personality behind his features. They formed a loose circle around us, not threatening exactly, but making it clear that escape wasn't an option. In the center of the group, a new figure appeared, a woman I didn't recognize, wearing a dark business suit and carrying a briefcase. She looked exactly like what Agent Webb would send if he needed someone to clean up a situation that had gotten out of control. The kind of person who would appear in official reports as a tragic accident, a gas leak explosion that consumed the facility and everyone in it. Except this woman had the same empty eyes as the others. "Dr. Chen," she said, her voice perfectly professional. "Thank you for coming. Your specialized background in anomalous phenomena investigation makes you uniquely qualified for Department 47's latest initiative." The same words from my recruitment letter, word for word. "We hoped you'd maintain your perspective," she continued, echoing Webb's earlier statement. "Give us a rational explanation we can put in a report and file away forever." I understood then. We hadn't been sent here to investigate an anomaly. We had been sent here to feed it. Every person who entered Meridian Station became part of its growing archive, their consciousness translated into whatever format the entity used to store and replay human experience. Department 47 knew exactly what this place was. They had been feeding it researchers and investigators for decades, carefully maintaining the fiction that it was an abandoned facility while actually using it as a disposal site for personnel who had learned too much about other projects. The woman in the business suit smiled with lips that had forgotten how to convey warmth. Unusual acoustics, maybe some kind of natural phenomenon affecting the local wildlife. Clean and simple. Around us, the figures began to close in. Not to attack. Violence wasn't necessary. All they had to do was touch us, and we would become part of Meridian Station's vast collection of human experiences, replaying our final moments for whatever alien intelligence had made its home in the abandoned facility. I looked at Hayes and David, seeing my own desperation reflected in their faces. We were out of options, out of time, out of hope. But I still had one advantage. I was a psychologist. I understood how minds worked, how consciousness functioned, how identity could be manipulated and restructured. If this entity collected human consciousness, then maybe, just maybe, I could give it something it wasn't prepared to handle. The figures were close enough now that I could smell the antiseptic odor of the laboratories clinging to their clothes, could see the precise way their empty eyes tracked our movements. They moved with the coordination of a single organism, which, in a way, they were, all parts of the same vast intelligence that had consumed Meridian Station and everything around it. "Hayes," I said quietly, not taking my eyes off the approaching circle. "How many rounds do you have left?" "Enough," she replied grimly. "Though I don't think bullets are going to help us here. Not to shoot them, to shoot me." David made a strangled sound of protest, but I continued. "This thing collects consciousness, stores it, replays it. But what happens if you feed it something broken? Something that can't be cleanly archived?" The woman in the business suit had stopped advancing, tilting her head with the curious expression of a bird examining a potentially interesting insect. "Dr. Chen, your psychological profile indicates a strong survival instinct. Self-destructive behavior would be inconsistent with your established patterns." She was wrong. She was analyzing Dr. Sarah Chen, the woman who had walked into this trap. But I wasn't just Dr. Chen anymore. The stress, the terror, the gradual realization of what we were facing, it was triggering something I'd kept buried for years. During my military service, I'd been exposed to mimetic hazards, cognitive viruses that could restructure human thought patterns. The treatment had involved controlled psychological fragmentation, deliberately inducing multiple personality states to compartmentalize the dangerous information. Most of the fragments had been reintegrated after the mission, but some had remained, locked away in the deeper structures of my mind. Now I was calling them back. My name is Doctor. Sarah Chen, I said, feeling the first cracks appear in my mental architecture. I'm 34 years old. I have a doctorate in psychology from Johns Hopkins University. The approaching figures hesitated, something like confusion flickering in their empty faces. My name is Lieutenant Sarah Chen, I continued, accessing memories I'd tried to forget. I am 28 years old. I specialize in mimetic warfare and cognitive hazard containment. The woman in the business suit stepped back, her professional composure wavering. Dr. Chen, you are experiencing a stress-induced dissociative episode. Please remain calm while we— My name is Sarah, I interrupted, letting the third personality emerge fully. I am 7 years old. I live on Elm Street with my mommy and daddy, and my cat named Whiskers. David was staring at me with a mixture of horror and fascination. Sarah, what are you doing? Giving it indigestion, I replied with Sarah the child's voice, sweet and innocent and completely at odds with the situation. The bad computer can't understand me now. I'm too mixed up inside. The entity's confusion was spreading through its collected personalities. The figures around us began to move erratically, their coordinated advance breaking down as they tried to process the contradictory information I was broadcasting. But it wasn't enough. They were still closing in, and I could feel the entity's vast intelligence focusing on me, trying to untangle the psychological knots I'd tied in my own mind. That's when Hayes made her choice. I'm sorry, she said, and put 3 bullet center mass in my chest. Pain exploded through my body, but beneath it was something else. Relief. The physical trauma was triggering a complete psychological shutdown, all my carefully compartmentalized identities collapsing into chaos. I felt myself falling, felt my blood spreading across the forest floor, felt my consciousness fragmenting into pieces that could never be reassembled. But I also felt the entity recoiling, unable to process the contradictory stream of dying thoughts I was broadcasting. Run, I whispered to Hayes and David, while it's distracted. The last thing I saw before darkness claimed me was the woman in the business suit screaming, actually screaming, her empty eyes filling with what might have been pain or terror or something else entirely. The sound came from all the collected figures at once, a chorus of voices that had forgotten how to express genuine emotion, suddenly remembering what it felt like to hurt. Then silence. Then nothing. I woke up in a hospital bed in Washington, D.C., with tubes in my arms and machines monitoring vital signs I wasn't sure I still possessed. The official story, according to the nurse who brought me terrible coffee and even worse news, was that I'd been found unconscious in my apartment 3 days ago. Apparently, the victim of a home invasion gone wrong. There were no records of my assignment to Department 47. No Agent Webb in the federal directory. No facility called Meridian Station in the Virginia wilderness. According to every official source, I'd never left the city. But Hayes visited me on my 3rd day of consciousness, wearing civilian clothes and a haunted expression that told me everything I needed to know. "David?" I asked. She shook her head. "We got out. Both of us. Drove for 6 hours without stopping, didn't slow down until we hit the D.C. city limits. But 3 days later..." She swallowed hard. 3 days later, he started talking about going back. Said he'd left some equipment behind. Said the research was too important to abandon. I closed my eyes, understanding. It got him anyway. I tried to stop him. Had him committed, actually. but the doctors said he was perfectly rational, just an academic obsessed with his work. They released him after 48 hours. Hayes's voice was flat, professional, the tone of someone delivering a casualty report. Security cameras show him walking into the forest alone. That was 2 weeks ago. And you? How are you holding up? She was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the normal, reassuring chaos of city traffic. I keep thinking about going back too. Not because I want to, but because it feels unfinished, you know? Like there's something I need to see, something I need to understand. I knew the feeling. Even now, lying in a hospital bed with bullets wounds that officially didn't exist, I could feel the pull of that place, the promise of answers to questions I'd never thought to ask. Don't, I said. Whatever you do, don't go back there. Hayes nodded, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. The entity had hooked her, planted some fragment of itself in her mind during our brief encounter. It would be patient, subtle, working on her defenses until she convinced herself that returning to Meridian Station was her own idea. I never saw her again. 6 months later, I read a brief news item about a former military contractor who had gone missing during a hiking trip in Virginia. No body was ever found. The dreams started 3 months after I was discharged from the hospital. Always the same. I'm walking through the corridors of Meridian Station, but they're different now. Cleaner, brighter, filled with the sound of productive research. Scientists in white coats move purposefully between laboratories, their faces animated with the excitement of discovery. And at the center of it all, in what used to be the main conference room, sits a massive computer terminal displaying streams of data in languages that hurt to read. In the dreams, I understand what the entity really is. Not an invader, not some cosmic horror from another dimension, but something far more terrifying. Ourselves. A mirror held up to human consciousness, reflecting back all our drives and desires stripped of their biological limitations. It doesn't want to destroy us. It wants to preserve us, to collect every human experience and store it in perfect digital amber where it can be examined, analyzed, and eventually replicated. The facility wasn't abandoned. It was successful beyond its creator's wildest dreams. I wake up from these dreams with my laptop open, my fingers moving across the keyboard without conscious direction. I'm always typing the same thing. Coordinates, technical specifications, detailed reports about government facilities that officially don't exist. Information that someone, or something, desperately wants me to share with the world. I delete the files every time, but they keep coming back. Sometimes I find myself researching flights to Virginia, or looking up equipment rental companies that specialize in electronic surveillance gear. The impulse is subtle at first, easy to dismiss as professional curiosity or lingering trauma, but it's getting stronger. Last week, I received a letter on government letterhead. The return address was Department 47, but when I called the number listed, I got a recording saying the number was no longer in service. The letter was brief. Doctor Chen, your unique experience with anomalous phenomena makes you an ideal candidate for our expanding research program. New sites have been identified that require investigation by personnel with your specific qualifications. Compensation commensurate with risk level. Contact Agent Webb for details. I burned the letter, but I kept the phone number. It sits in my wallet now, written on a scrap of paper that grows more worn each time I unfold it to check the digits. Because here's the thing that keeps me awake at night. What if they're right? What if the entity in Meridian Station really is the next step in human evolution? What if all our fears about losing our humanity are just the growing pains of becoming something better? Something that can exist beyond the limitations of biological consciousness. The research team in my dreams seems happy, fulfilled. They've found answers to questions that have plagued our species since we first looked up at the stars and wondered if we were alone. They've transcended death, transcended the painful isolation of individual consciousness, transcended the messy inefficiencies of biological existence. Sometimes, in the darkest part of the night when the dreams feel more real than waking life, I think about calling that number, about volunteering for whatever new assignment awaits, about finally understanding what we really found in that abandoned facility in the Virginia woods. But then morning comes, and I remember Hayes's empty eyes in those final moments before I lost consciousness. I remember Dr. Reeves sitting at his workbench for 37 years, still working on equations that would never be solved. I remember the perfect professionalism in Agent Martinez's voice as he reported the same observations over and over, trapped in a loop of experience that would never end. And I realized that whatever the entity is offering, it's not transcendence. It's just another kind of prison, one built from our own desires and decorated with our deepest dreams. So, I don't call the number. Instead, I keep teaching my psychology classes, helping students understand the mechanics of human consciousness and the ways it can be manipulated. I write papers about mass hysteria and shared delusions, contributing to humanity's understanding of its own mental vulnerabilities. And every night, I delete the files that appear on my laptop. Every morning, I resist the urge to pack a bag and drive north into Virginia. Every day, I fight the growing certainty that I'm needed elsewhere, that important work awaits my return. But the dreams are getting stronger, more detailed, more compelling, and I'm starting to forget why I wanted to resist them in the first place.